Good morning, everyone. We want to welcome you to our webinar. We're going to be talking about budgeting and planning with our very own James Strack. He is a business analyst here at Innovia Consulting. I know we're all looking forward to it. There's been a lot of interest, a lot of registration for the webinar. So I want to get to it real quickly. Just a couple pieces of housekeeping before we get started with James. First, we do record this and all of our webinars. So if you want to watch it again, if you want someone else in your organization to see it, it will be on our website by later this afternoon. And of course, our website is innovia.com. Second, if you have any questions, you can type them into that question box. I will get them called out and answered for you. So without any further ado, James, I'm going to hand it right over to you.
Thanks, Abby. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. And really the focus of today is to just talk about some budgeting ideas and concepts from the perspective of the CIO's chair. As many of you know, but for those who don't, I was a former CIO for 17 years for a fairly large organization. We had about 2,000 employees, did business in 35 states and had revenues in the several billion. So I've been working with Innovia for a couple of years in the customer engagement team, and we'll get started. So our first goal is budgeting and planning. Okay, so our agenda for this is first we're going to discuss the budgeting process, then what questions you should ask as you're putting your budgets together for approval, the review of the process itself, and then of course questions when we're done. So, how's the budget determined? This changes from organization to organization. As a general rule, it comes from the top down. So we get mandates from the executive team, whether it's the owner or the president or the CEO, or you have an executive team that comes up with a preliminary budget. We also ask for departmental input. It's very important when you're putting your budgets together that we don't miss something. And we have to ask for input. We need to know what everybody's doing. For us to turn over to top management a number that's a viable number, we really need to know what everyone else's goals and objectives are. Strategic goals. The company will have strategic goals. What is the company's goal in life? What is its strategic plan? You know, is it to grow 10 times over the next 5 years? Knowing those strategic goals of the company help you set a budget for growth. Replacement costs. One of the things we're always tracking is equipment and software and saying what needs to be replaced this year, what is becoming obsolete, what needs to be rotated out. Those are things you need to keep in mind. And then you have fixed and discretionary spending. You have a lot of fixed costs that you've signed contracts for. And those numbers are going to reoccur, and they're non-negotiable. And then you have the discretionary spending. You know, do we buy new equipment? Do we upgrade software? Do we bring in some consulting folks or outside programmers? So that's all the discretionary spending that's available to you. Next, when we talk about the mandates, you know, questions that we can be talking about too is we need to know what those mandates are from the executive team. But sometimes it will be a very generic phrase. So we need to review it with them, and we need to do the research. So if they say, you know, my goal is to grow 5 times over the next year, we need to talk about that. We need to have conversations. We need to know what that means. Are we talking growth in the number of customers, growth in the revenue dollars? What kind of growth are we talking about? What are the mandates and what's involved in that, so you know what it's going to take to get you there. We need to know what the timelines are for some of these mandates. Many of these mandates will be a multi-year process, in which case, as you're budgeting, that budget is going to cross multiple years. And you will have to decide whether 60% of that budget comes year 1, and then 20% year 2. Does it get broken out evenly for each year? So knowing the timelines for some of the mandates that are coming from the top executives is very important. Whether it's a CapEx, or just an expense item. Many times when you're dealing with budgets, you're given a number, but if you're going to capitalize a project, then it won't go against your budget. And in other cases, you just outright pay for it up front as an expense item. So knowing and talking to not only the management team and the accounting folks to decide how is a project going to be expensed will also affect the way your budget works. From the departmental view, even if it's a small company, you still have someone who's doing your accounts payable, you still have someone doing receivables or inventory, and it could all be the same people, it could be, a couple different folks, or you could be a large company where you have a very dedicated department. But still talking to the folks about that process and saying, what's the goal? Is the goal to be a little more efficient this year? Is the goal to say, hey, we found this problem that we'd like to fix. We see a bottleneck that we want to resolve. What is the goal for each of these? So you can look at it and say, what does it take to get there? If they're offering up projects, looking at the ROI for the projects. So when you're justifying your budget, we need to spend, X dollars in this department to accomplish this goal. However, there's a payback, and the payback is a certain window. So it's important to know, is this a project that even has an ROI to it? Not all projects do, and we'll talk about that shortly. And then growth. By talking to everybody, because a budget doesn't exist in a vacuum. A budget is part of a process overall for the business. What is the departmental growth plan? Do they have any? Is there intention to actually downsize? Or is there intention to expand? So we need to ask those kind of things to know what's going on. Strategic goals. When I do budgeting, this is a big part of my budget, is spending time looking at the strategic goal of the business. So not the strategic goal of the IT shop, but the strategic goal of the business. What is it we're trying to do? And then from an IT perspective, it's how do we leverage technology to achieve that business goal? Some of the things we have to do when we're looking at strategic goals is, are we dealing with some obsolete technologies? Is it time to move on to the next piece of technology to solve a problem? What's the long-term objectives? Do we put in infrastructure to come up with a plan that deals with how to get us to that 5-year growth or 10-year growth plan? And then my personal mantra that I've lived with my entire life, and it seems simple, but it's very straightforward, and it's always been strategize, standardize, minimize. I always have that running through my head. One of the biggest things you have to do in the IT world is convince the business folks that you're just not here to play with IT toys and gadgets, and that you understand the business side of life. So looking at how to strategize with the business goals and how to leverage technology makes a big difference. And then replacement costs. We all know that equipment wears out. I know people, sometimes you walk into a budget meeting and they say, well, we bought that computer 10 years ago. It should still work. But again, keeping up on obsolete technologies, knowing what's out there, we know that a certain amount of infrastructure probably needs to be upgraded or replaced, or we have to rotate equipment out. Sometimes you can take an older piece of equipment and repurpose it. And then you have technology changes. If you're dealing with multiple businesses and different offices or locations, you may have to rethink that whole strategy. Is T1 technology still cost effective and viable for the business? Or do we go to MPLS? And now with the advent of SIP trunking, is that now the correct answer? So always trying to keep your eye on what's going on and how do we move forward. Fixed and discretionary spending. We need to make a list. We need to know what the monthly fixed or annual fixed costs are, things that you sign contracts for, such as your internet services. If you're having telephony services and anything that's renewable, maintenance contracts, are all things that are fixed. And I put those in a separate area in the budget so that you know that this is fixed cost. We really don't have the ability to just walk away from this without penalties, so they need to be separated and identified as this is a reoccurring, under contract, fixed fee. Then we have the discretionary spending, non-mission critical things that, can I get by another year with this piece of equipment? Do we need to replace these routers, firewalls, whatever type of software we might be using? You know, the software probably should be updated, but we can hold off another year. That's a lot of discretionary spending that needs to be reviewed and discussed. The R&D thing is something I'm concerned with when we're talking about budgets. People don't always put this in their budget. They should always try to find a way to put a certain dollar amount for research and development. The technology world changes so rapidly. To help it accomplish the business goals, sometimes we need to say, we need to try something out. We need to create a silo here and test some new technology, test some new equipment, try a new piece of software without impacting the rest of the business. And do that at a very low cost, but we need to know, will this actually work for us? Not all technologies work for everybody. You can't always leverage the same technologies that the business down the street uses. So having some money in there to discuss and play and test these kind of things to say what will work best for us before we make commitments of any large dollar expenditure just makes a lot of sense. Okay, questions we should ask when we're talking about budgets. You know, is there an ROI for the additional projects, equipment? And if so, you know, we need to go through that ROI process. We have to prove out that there's, yes, this is cost effective. Yes, there's money here. There's a return on this. But sometimes, and sometimes people get hung up, oh, it has to have an ROI. But sometimes it's the cost of doing business. There are times that you have to spend money. There is no technical return on investment. It's the cost of doing business. You need to have lights and electricity in your building. There's not necessarily an ROI for that. It's the cost of doing business. If you have employees and you have an office, you need desks, you need chairs, you need things for them to work on, which don't necessarily have an ROI. So sometimes you're making expenditures that are the cost of doing business. And my experience, 30 plus years in the IT world, is it's better to tell the executive team up front that here's an expenditure, it doesn't have a technical ROI to it, it's the cost of doing business. This is something we have to have in place just to operate. Does it fit the strategic goals? So when you're setting up your budget, you're going to be talking to departments, you're going to be talking to all kinds of folks, you're going to get mandates from the executive team. You need to look at all of that and say, does it fit into the business's strategic goal? And if it doesn't, it's okay to question it. It's okay to say, hey, can we have a conversation? Can we discuss this and say, you're looking to do this, but it doesn't, you know, the strategic goal of the company is to do this. How does that fit in there? That way you can identify pieces of your budget that if you have to start cutting back and if you have to make adjustments, you can say, well, this is something someone wants to do. It doesn't directly impact a strategic goal or vision of the business. And therefore, it's a piece that can be negotiated if need be. Does it benefit and achieve your business goals? Ultimately, you have to look at technology as it's here to benefit the business. It's here to help the business do whatever its business goal is, whether that's to service more customers, whether it's to sell more product, what its growth plans are. Maybe you're going to add a second office. How does it achieve that, and how does it complement the business goal? So that always needs to be in the back of your head of how does it benefit the business. And the reason for that is this next one, which is technology for technology's sake. 30 plus years ago when I started in the IT world, business drove technology. Technology was being developed to accomplish very specific business goals. Today, technology is being driven by the consumer. And so the consumers are driving technology decisions and technology development. And that always sometimes will clash with the business goals, because a consumer will want certain things that really don't benefit the business at all. And so part of it is looking at it and saying, is this something somebody wants just because it's nice to have, and what does it really bring to the business? What does it really do to achieve a business goal? And that's a much harder thing to look at today, because people will stand in line and say, hey, we need to do this. Hey, I saw this new product. Oh, we saw this new gadget. We saw this new software. That's all being driven by the consumer market. So it's a much harder task now to sit down and say, does this do something for the business, or are we just grabbing a gadget or a piece of software because it's the latest and greatest thing out there? Value to the business. Does it bring value to the business? It's always the bottom line when you're doing your budget and you're asking people for money. They're going to want to know, what does it do for the business? And the fact that it's a nice to have, and I'd love to be able to stream my Netflix to the wall on my desk and play my iPod and everything else. If it doesn't bring value to the business, those are all nice things to have, but they don't achieve a business goal. And then set priorities. Once we've made the list of everything people want and what we think brings value, we have to set the priority. Again, the priorities get balanced against the strategic goal. So we need to know, if we have a list of 10 items, what's the priority of that list? So if we have to, from a budgetary standpoint, start taking things away, we know we can just start at the bottom and work our way up. So it's important that before you even present a budget, we know exactly what the priority is for anything on that budget list. We'll move on to a process review. And it's important that you know these numbers. It's important that to be taken serious at the business level, the IT folks have to develop business acumen. And they need to be able to answer questions, and they need to be able to present factual numbers, so that when questions are asked of the why and where's this money going, it's easy to say, here's exactly where it is. So being able to track and build things for your budget. So we know, if we look at these charts, that 77% of all our expenses for our budget are fixed numbers, are contract numbers, they're reoccurring expenses. And 23% of our budget is going to be spent on one-time things, new PCs, a new printer, maybe a piece of software. But once it's paid for, it's done until it needs to be replaced maybe years from now. But being able to explain that, let people know that, will have a lot of impact. Next is a chart here. Same thing. If you have multiple departments or multiple divisions, it's important that you can show people where those numbers are coming from and where they're going. So it's nice to know that we have 3 departments or 3 divisions, and here's where the dollars are being spent. So when someone's looking at something to say, do we make this expenditure, it's easy to balance it. This division is one of our divisions that have a lot of growth. Therefore, we're going to spend more money, and it's justifiable. One is larger than the other. One is smaller than the other. It's always important to know where the money's going, and that you know from a business standpoint where the money's going. So when someone asks you, why are we spending so much money? on software or licenses or telephony circuits. You can say, well, this office, this department has this need. This is where the money's going. Again, another chart that shows, well, here's our total overall budget and how it's being spent by either division or department. So again, someone can say, okay, we've got a budget, we're going to make a budget cut. We want 10%. How does that affect each department? How does it affect each division or area of the business? And it's important that you have these numbers so that you can talk to folks and say, look, here's the impact. You can't make some of these changes without creating other issues. And let them know that so that there's a conversation. So we always have a conversation going, and we always have numbers to back up our conversation. These have to be a very non-emotional conversation and have to be very factual with the numbers to say, here's the number, here's why, here's what's going on, so that you can justify the expenditure and it doesn't sound like you're just having an emotional argument. Something I always tracked was expenses by category. I want to know how much I'm spending on our main applications to run the business, such as your NAV ERP product. How much money are you spending in infrastructure to maintain your business? This is a number that you get to look at and say, geez, I'm spending 29% of our budget dollars in infrastructure. Maybe this is the time to move to the cloud and reduce that 29%, because right now those are costs for our data center, our servers, all of our WAN connections, our backups, our disaster recovery, business continuity planning, all those things that have to be taken into account. Knowing that 2% for departmental applications, there are specific software that has to be purchased just for a department. And maybe that is in your, if you have a banking section where they're taking checks and processing checks, there's machines you can buy that scan the checks and automatically send it to your bank. It could be EDI software for shipping. So different things that are very specific to a specific department. And in this case, if you look, 46% of the budget is spent in communications. So that's a lot of dollars being spent having the offices interconnected, talking to the outside world. So that is a number that if we're looking to say, how do we make a change? How do we streamline? How do we become more efficient? That's a great place to look. But by knowing these numbers by some major categories, and the goal is not to get too specific where you end up with 100 slices here, because then it won't be meaningful. Having it in some major categories and deciding what those major categories are for you will make all the difference, and it will help having that conversation. Why do we spend so much in infrastructure? Well, this is our data center cost. This is our interconnectivity cost. Well, what if we went to the cloud? Here's our communication expense. Well, what if we switched from having a standard phone system to doing voice over IP and doing soft phones? All good questions to have in conversations, but we need to have these numbers in order to have those kind of conversations. What you need to do, you need to be prepared when you present a budget. You have to be prepared. You have to know exactly where all the numbers are, where everything's coming from. Ideally, the way I used to submit budgets is I would submit a summary page budget, which is said, here's my budget for the next year. Sometimes they'd ask for the next 2 or 3 year projections, but here's my next year's budget. Here's some basic categories, summary information, and then behind it, I might have 30 or 40 pages of documents, so I know if a question came up, why is this number here? What's this for? I have the background to have all those conversations we just talked about, why it fits strategically, why it's something that's necessary, why this is a fixed cost, why this is potentially discretionary spending, knowing that you have answers to those kind of questions. Otherwise, sometimes it's a stall tactic just to push back on your budget. Start early in the process. A lot of this information takes time to collect and analyze. And if you're asked to put a budget together and you have a week to do it, it's going to be very difficult for you to put the numbers together and then justify the expenditures. And it's a lot easier than for someone to say no. So starting early, once they submit a budget, I generally actually start the process within a few weeks to a month for the next year, because I need to know what new technologies are rolling out there, what's going on, what did I get this budget or the last budget that I need to carry over to the next year. So there's always things. So if you do it as a process and an ongoing process, it doesn't take a ton of time. It will take a fair amount of time over a long stretch, but if you try to cram it into a week or a couple of days, you're going to miss a lot of things, and there's going to be a lot of gotchas and a lot of surprises which nobody's happy with in the budgets. One of my phrases of squeeze, 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 to be taken serious in the business world, a lot of times the IT folks have to show that they have a business acumen. They have to show that they're thinking about the business and they're just not thinking about the world of IT. The company where I was the CIO for, everybody introduced them and they say, this is James Strack, he's our CIO, except the president of the company was a much older gentleman, and he understood that technology was valuable to the business and needed, but he didn't understand technology as a whole. So whenever he introduced me, he used to say, he's the IT guy. So to be taken serious and to make sure that there's relevancy, it was important to know that, yes, I'm looking after the business. I care about the business. I care about the business's money. And so therefore, I want to take whatever the budget numbers are. I want to make sure there's no fat in it. You want to be very lean. You want to make sure there's not a lot of fluff, and that you can justify every dollar that's on that number. Do your research. This goes back to that whole process of being taken serious. You can come in and just say, oh, we need 20 new printers. The question that comes back to you is why, and when you think about it, it's easy just to say I need 20 new printers. Now, this goes back several years ago, but several years ago, you used to have fax machines, you used to have printers, you used to have copiers. You bought all three of them, you ended up buying a ton of them. And then over time, technology changed where all of those components could be purchased into one piece of equipment. But it was still easy for someone just to say, oh, I need to replace that fax machine. If you're doing your research, you know what's coming up in technology, you know where the trends are going, then you can come back and say, well, you know what? Instead of doing this, we're going to do something new and different, which reduces our hardware, reduces our costs, increases our efficiency, and it's a way just to gain respect that you're keeping on top of the process. And your answers aren't just a knee-jerk re-answer, oh, that piece of equipment must be replaced because it's getting old. Think it through, make sure it's still a valid piece of equipment, and it's still valid to replace it. Think outside the box. When you're doing strategic planning, and certainly as a CIO, that's really what your goal is, to do strategic planning for the business and say, how do I leverage technology to achieve our business goals? You have to think outside the box. So you have to know what's going on in new technology. You have to know what's going on in the business world so that you can think, here's the way it's done. Now let's take a step outside the box. Let's go a mile high and say, how else can we do this? If we had to start all over again, if we had to go from scratch, if we wanted to take it from a different point of view, turn it around, spin it around, but don't be afraid to say, hey, look, let's look outside the box. This is where that R&D budget comes in. We're going to try something completely out the box. So I beta tested Mitel, who had a phone system. One of our biggest challenges with our backup and disaster recovery plan was we could build a disaster recovery site. We could replicate all our servers, but our phone system was a proprietary box, and all of our servers were virtualized. So that was a stumbling block for 100% completion of our DR plan. Well, Mitel came up with a virtual phone system that you could build on a virtual server. Therefore, you no longer needed the proprietary box. And that's, so I said, okay, we'll test it, we'll play with it. That was part of our R&D dollars. We validated it worked, and that finished our last piece of our disaster recovery plan. But we had to be willing to take that risk and take out and say, okay, what's the technology behind this? Let's think outside the box. Let's get rid of the proprietary piece of equipment. Always be thinking and planning. So things that we need to present when we're doing our budget. We really need to present a summary budget. Most executive teams, whether it's the president or CIO or owner, do not want to read 50 to 100 page document. They're really looking for a budget that has a summary page that says, here's our breakdown, here's what we need. And then they will look at numbers and then start having a conversation. That's when you need to have the detail to back up those numbers so a conversation can be had. Breaking out your recurring and fixed expenses. It's important to have that in a section all by itself. So we know this is our fixed fees. You know, we've signed an internet contract for bandwidth. We're committed to that. You know, here's the cost we're committed to. We have software that we have maintenance, annual maintenance fees on. So have those listed in a section by itself. I also break down applications by corporate and departmental. So here's our corporate applications, such as Microsoft Dynamics Nav. And this is software that's used at the corporate level, email, corporate level software. Things that are used by absolutely everybody. Then I break it down to departmental applications. Here's very specific software used for a very specific purpose by a certain number of people. That's a great number, because when you look at those numbers, that's a place you can say, well, is that a piece of software that's not specific? Can we incorporate that somewhere else? Then you break a section down for infrastructure. Here's my current infrastructure. And by having that broken out, then when you want to talk about things like, is it time to move to the cloud? Is it time to go virtual? You know, is it time to change out your phone system and do VoIP? All those kind of things, if we know exactly what our infrastructure costs are, then we know when we go to research, are we going to save money? Are we going to be more efficient by having that broken out as a separate piece? I also break out the communication piece so that we know what's our cost, what's our telephony cost, what do we pay for internet, do we have redundant internet, do we have redundant paths, do we have a wide area network that we have to deal with, what's the cost of connecting all the points. So again, we see what our communication costs are. And if you remember from the previous slide, you know, it was 49% of the budget or something like that, that was for communications. That's nice to know and having a separate number. It really gives you a focal point to say, this is an area we could try to squeeze. This is an area we can try to find efficiencies and streamline. And then I always have a section for external costs. If we use outside programmers, if we have any kind of outside expense, if we bring outside consultants in, maybe you take your payroll and you send your payroll outside. Any kind of thing like that's an external cost. having that listed in a section, because that will be an area that you can say, maybe we're spending so much with outside programmers, we should look at bringing programming in-house. So having those numbers broken out in a section by itself helps have that conversation. And then we have to have the miscellaneous section. Where do we put training? Your equipment starts to get old. Now everything has to be disposed of. You can't just throw it in the dumpster anymore. Sometimes people pick it up for free. Sometimes they will charge you, but you have to now dispose of equipment, and there's a cost to doing that. So we need to have that in there as well. So if we're looking at green technologies, or it's another dollar piece to say, if I go to cloud computing, will I save in my hazmat disposal expenses? I threw up this slide to emphasize a point. Some of you may recognize some of these pictures, and some of you may not. You have I remember punching IBM cards. In my lifetime, everything you see here has been developed and has become obsolete. So in a very short period of time. I remember punching IBM cards when I first started in the IT world and programming. And you see pictures of diskettes. I remember I worked for a law firm in New York, and every will and legal document was in a hanging file folder, all on 8-inch floppy disks. Reel-to-reel tapes. The disk platter that you will see in the center there, that is a giant disk platter, probably held about 100 megs and cost $10,000 or so. And in the bottom, you'll see a Cray Super One computer, which has now been replaced by significantly smaller, faster. The chart on the right, which I always fondly remember, one of the courses I took early in my career was mathematics for data processing, and you had to, in your head, convert dec to hex, the oct to binary to ASCII, and back and forth in your head, because you needed that to do programming. And all of this is stuff that, again, this is how rapidly our world changes. This is how rapidly technology changes. And in 30 years, the changes have been just phenomenal. So constantly doing research, constantly staying on top of what's going on, and being able to balance what's going on and what's going to help your company in the future has a huge impact. And it's really important that you don't remain status quo and we don't remain stagnant, because this world changes way too fast for that to happen. And by presenting budgets that are very documented, very detail-oriented, that you can justify what's going on and that you can explain every piece of it, will bide you credence and give you the knowledge to work through a budget process, and they can see that, yes, this is stuff that needs to be done, and you can work through the approval process much faster, much easier. Okay. So, at this point, I'd like to turn it open for questions if anyone has any. I certainly appreciate your time.
We do have a couple of questions, James. Our first one, how do you position your budget to get approval?
Great question. Really, that is all about the detail. If I walk into the owner or a CEO and I say, I need $1 million in my budget, and they're going to ask you to justify every dollar of that. So spending the time to make sure you have all the backup, you have all the research, you have all the detail, so that he knows you're just not spouting off a number, and that you have justifiable reasons why this expenditure needs to be made, is going to give you the best opportunity to get a budget approved.
Okay, great. Our next question, what is the best way to handle unforeseen expenses?
Good question for that one, is because what happens with budgets is let's just say you get a budget approved and the budget is $1 million. And then all of a sudden you need to buy, either because you hired more people or maybe there was an acquisition, and all of a sudden now you need to spend significantly more money. It's important that you have what I call a budget change order, so that at the end of the year, it's easy for people to forget that you had $1 million budget and you spent $1.5 million, and then you're brought to task to say, you said $1 million, you spent $1.5 million. What's going on? Being able to do a budget change order, just like you would do a change order for software development or anything other project you have, so that you can show that you had an original budget of this because of this unforeseen circumstance, hiring new people or an acquisition or a merger required you to spend additional sums of money. So you have an adjusted budget that you can say, here's why this came up in the middle of the budget cycle that none of us were made aware of. So I think that's a very important thing to do.
Okay. And our final question that we have so far is, should IT control the purchasing, or should the individual departments or people control it?
Another great question. This is something you'll debate for the rest of your life in your offices. I truly believe that centralized processing is the best way to go. A lot of times the IT folks will just pass off and say, well, you go ahead and buy it. You want it, you buy it. Because they don't want to take the time. But it's important that if you build a strategy, you need to make sure that purchases fit that mold. They fit that product. We want all of our products to be a product that can be done remotely, that can be handled in a thin environment, that can be handled in the cloud. And someone goes out and buys a piece of software that has to sit on a physical piece of device, or it uses an old technology. A true story, we virtualized all of our servers in our data center, and then lo and behold, someone went out, unbeknownst to us, and bought a piece of software that was DOS-based that had to sit on the PC sitting in the corner of their office. And we said, no, it's just not going to work. So you can avoid those problems by having conversations, but being open to those conversations. And centralized processing generally will save you money because you'll have a relationship with vendors, and you'll know then exactly what dollars are being spent. In the budget world, there's a problem that you end up with rogue purchases, where you're budgeted $1 million, for example, and there are numbers you don't know that's being spent by individuals because they went out and say, well, I'm just going to buy my own equipment. And so they went out and bought their own Bluetooth headset and their own Bluetooth wireless keyboards and mouse. And then when they break, they say, oh, by the way, I need a replacement. And the next thing you know, you find yourself buying things you didn't even know you had in the first place. So from an inventory control, from a cost control, and from a technology control to make sure everything fits your plans and your goals, I really believe it's important that IT has control of the purchasing process.
All right. Well, that appears to be all of our questions. I'll give everybody just another minute. Oh, we've got one more. How much do you inflate your budget so that you are, quote, on budget for any unforeseen issues?
I generally don't inflate my budget. I mean, one of the ways to build the respect and the credence from the business side is to give them a budget that's a good, hard, solid number that's been well planned out, but make it very clear that anything that's unforeseen will have to be a change order to the budget. So I've seen people do 10% as a common number. The problem with inflating the number by, say, 10% is that most business owners know that you're inflating the number. And so I've had it told to me, well, I know you automatically inflate these numbers 10% or 20%. So, strip your budget down another 10 or 20%. if you can show them in hard numbers that no, you haven't done that, it will gain a certain amount of respect over. I mean, it may take time, but you can do that. But be willing to do the budget change order process for unforeseen expenditures, or at least set money aside in a slush fund where you have a budget item that be for unforeseen items would be another way to handle it. But I just wouldn't pad the number itself.
Okay, if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them into that question box. I will just remind everybody that we have recorded this session, so you will be able to view it by the end of the day. It's going to be on our website, innovia.com. And James, it looks like those are all the questions, so we just want to thank you so much for your presentation today.
Well, I want to thank everyone for participating, and we greatly appreciate it. We hope that you'll come back for the other webinars that we have, and wish everyone a happy holiday.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll see you next time.